The clock read 8:42 a.m. as Marcus Carter parked his car in the lot outside the county courthouse in Raleigh, North Carolina. The warm morning sunlight cast long shadows across the asphalt, and Marcus exhaled deeply. He hated being late. As a federal prosecutor, his professional life revolved around discipline and preparedness. But today, life had conspired against him. This wasn't supposed to be a complicated morning. The task ahead was mundane, challenging an error in a property tax adjustment on the house his grandmother left him. The city had raised the taxes inexplicably, and Marcus had spent weeks gathering proof that it was a mistake. The house was more than property to him. It was the anchor of his childhood, the place where he had learned right from wrong under his grandmother's watchful eye. Dressed in a dark grey suit with a crisp white shirt, Marcus looked every bit the seasoned attorney he was, even if his morning had been far from smooth. An urgent phone call about an ongoing human trafficking case had delayed him. The defense team had filed a last-minute motion, and Marcus couldn't ignore it. He had reviewed the motion and provided feedback to his team before rushing to court, knowing he was cutting it close. As he approached the courthouse steps, his phone buzzed. A quick glance showed a message from his assistant at the U.S. Attorney's Office. "The judge in Raleigh has a reputation for being tough on latecomers. Be careful." Marcus sighed, tucking his phone into his briefcase. He wasn't worried. Facts were his weapon, and he came armed with evidence. But something in the message lingered. He shook it off as he stepped into the cool interior of the courthouse. The county court wasn't like the federal courts, where Marcus spent most of his days. The walls were a dull beige, the seats scuffed from decades of use, and the air smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. Despite its worn appearance, the place buzzed with activity. People shuffled in and out, clutching stacks of documents, faces etched with anxiety over parking tickets, minor disputes, and other small claims. Marcus checked his watch. 8:50 a.m. 10 minutes to spare, barely enough time to find the correct courtroom. He followed the signs down a narrow hallway, passing people speaking in hushed tones. Room 212. Judge Walter Jennings was etched in brass on the door. Marcus adjusted his tie and stepped inside. The courtroom was already filling with people. Marcus found a spot near the back and sat down, flipping open his folder to review his evidence. As he scanned his notes, he noticed the judge entering the room. Judge Walter Jennings, a tall man with a silver mane and piercing blue eyes, commanded attention without saying a word. His reputation as a no-nonsense figure was evident in the way he scanned the room, his sharp gaze missing nothing. "All rise," the bailiff announced. The room shuffled to its feet. Marcus joined in, his posture straight as the judge settled into his chair. Marcus noticed the stark silence that followed. Judge Jennings began calling cases one by one with mechanical efficiency, his tone crisp and detached. Marcus watched closely. A middle-aged man in a suit, arriving a few minutes late, shuffled into the room unnoticed. Moments later, a young woman in casual clothes slipped in and took a seat. Neither received so much as a glance from the judge. Marcus made a mental note but focused on his own case. Finally, at 9:15 a.m., Marcus heard his name called. He gathered his folder and made his way to the podium, projecting calm despite the slight delay. As he approached, Judge Jennings looked up, his expression hardening. Marcus felt the shift in the room, a quiet tension that hadn't been present for the previous cases. "You're late, Mr. Carter," the judge said sharply, his voice cutting through the room. "Do you think the court's time is less valuable than your own?" Marcus raised his hand slightly, palms out in a gesture of acknowledgement. "Your Honor, I apologize for the delay. I was attending to urgent federal matters." The judge cut him off. "Excuses don't excuse tardiness. This court operates on order and respect. If you can't follow that, I suggest you reevaluate your priorities." Marcus felt the weight of dozens of eyes on him. He maintained his composure, choosing his next words carefully. "Your Honor, I understand the importance of timeliness. If I may, I'd like to present my case regarding the property tax adjustment." Judge Jennings waved a hand dismissively. "We'll get to that. First, there's the matter of contempt. Tardiness undermines the integrity of these proceedings. You are hereby fined $750. The words hung in the air like a hammer striking an anvil. Marcus's jaw tightened slightly, but he kept his expression neutral. Around him, murmurs rippled through the room. "Your Honor," Marcus began, his tone calm and measured. "May I explain?" The judge raised his gavel, silencing him. "You may not. Consider this a lesson in respecting the court." Marcus stepped back, his mind racing. This wasn't just about tardiness. It was about something deeper, something that many in the room had likely seen before. He glanced briefly at the other latecomers, none of whom had been reprimanded. The disparity was glaring, and Marcus wasn't about to let it slide. As he returned to his seat, Marcus opened his folder, but this time it wasn't the property tax documents he focused on. He began jotting notes, his pen moving swiftly across the page. The judge, meanwhile, continued with the next case, his voice unwavering. Marcus knew one thing for certain. This was no ordinary morning. Marcus sat in the back row, his mind a whirlwind of calculations and observations. The courtroom proceeded in its rhythm, but Marcus couldn't shake the blatant disparity he had just witnessed. He replayed the moment Judge Jennings imposed the $750 fine, contrasting it with the indifference shown to others who had arrived late. The young woman who had slipped in earlier sat near the front, scrolling on her phone, untouched by reprimand. A man in a grey blazer, now presenting his case, had clearly walked in after the judge began. Yet, the gavel's ire had been reserved solely for Marcus. This wasn't an isolated moment. It was a pattern Marcus could recognize as plainly as the documents in his briefcase. He turned to his legal instincts, assessing the situation with precision. A fine this steep for tardiness in county court was extreme, even punitive. He noted the expressions of those around him, a mix of disbelief, discomfort, and curiosity. Marcus could tell that others in the room were thinking the same thing, but no one dared to speak. When the session ended, Marcus lingered for a moment as people filed out. He observed the way they carried the unspoken weight of what had transpired. A young law student sitting in the corner scribbled furiously in her notebook, her expression one of awe and determination. Marcus left the courtroom with his briefcase in hand, his thoughts already forming a plan. This was no longer about a property tax adjustment or even the fine. This was about something much larger, something he couldn't ignore. As Marcus exited the courthouse, the crisp air outside offered no relief from the tension that still clung to him. The courthouse buzzed with the mundane movements of everyday proceedings, but inside Marcus's mind, a decision was solidifying. He paused for a moment on the courthouse steps, staring at his phone, his thumb hovering over the contact for his assistant U.S. attorney back at the office. "No," he muttered to himself, "not yet." He stepped aside to review his notes again. The interactions he had witnessed and experienced in Judge Jennings's courtroom painted a clear picture. The disparity wasn't incidental, it was structural. Marcus's legal instincts told him he now had the seeds of a much larger case, one that went beyond property taxes or even his personal treatment. Back in his car, Marcus opened his briefcase, pulling out his badge and credentials. The federal prosecutor's emblem, embossed in gold, reflected the sunlight streaming through his windshield. He decided this would be the first move. By the time he re-entered the courtroom, most of the morning cases had concluded. The room was quieter, though a few stragglers remained, flipping through papers or waiting for their turn. Judge Jennings was leafing through documents, his demeanor calm but visibly tired. Marcus walked confidently toward the bench, his badge and identification in hand. As he approached the podium, the court clerk raised her eyes, her fingers pausing mid-type. Judge Jennings glanced up, his irritation returning almost instantly. "Mr. Carter, the court session has concluded. If you have further business, you'll need to schedule an appointment," the judge said curtly. "With respect, Your Honor," Marcus began, his voice carrying a quiet authority, "I believe it's important to formally introduce myself." He held his badge up slightly, making sure it was clearly visible to everyone in the room. "I'm Marcus Carter, Assistant United States Attorney for the Eastern District of North Carolina. I've been with the Department of Justice for over a decade, focusing on cases of human trafficking, corruption, and civil rights violations." The judge froze, his hands stilling over the papers he was handling. The color drained from his face as Marcus's words registered. Around the room, the remaining spectators watched intently, their expressions a mix of curiosity and anticipation. I was late this morning because of an urgent federal case requiring my immediate attention, Marcus continued, his tone firm but respectful. And while I understand the importance of court procedures, I couldn't help but notice the disparity in how cases were handled here today. The judge's lips pressed into a thin line. Mr. Carter, if you feel there was a procedural issue, you're welcome to file a formal complaint. I've already begun documenting the events of this morning, Marcus replied, holding up his notebook. Not just my own treatment, but the differing responses to other latecomers, particularly along racial lines. As an officer of the court, I'm obligated to report any patterns of bias or discrimination I encounter. Judge Jennings leaned back in his chair, clearly uneasy. Are you accusing this court of misconduct, Mr. Carter? I'm stating what I observed, Your Honor, Marcus said calmly. As a federal prosecutor, I've dedicated my career to ensuring justice is applied equally, regardless of who stands before the bench. What I witnessed today raises serious concerns. The silence in the room was deafening. The court clerk glanced nervously between Marcus and the judge, her hands hovering uncertainly over the keyboard. The young law student in the back corner was furiously jotting notes, her eyes wide with fascination. The judge cleared his throat, attempting to regain control. This court takes such matters seriously. If you believe there was an error in judgment, I suggest addressing it through the appropriate channels. Marcus placed his badge and identification on the podium. I intend to, Your Honor, but I also believe this moment presents an opportunity for reflection on how we ensure that the principles of fairness and equality are upheld in every courtroom. Judge Jennings shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. He had presided over this courtroom for decades, his authority rarely questioned so directly. For the first time, it seemed his confidence faltered. You may go, Mr. Carter, the judge said, his voice quieter now. Marcus collected his credentials and turned to leave, but not before offering one final statement. Thank you, Your Honor. I'll ensure this is addressed properly. As Marcus walked out of the courtroom for the second time that morning, he felt the eyes of every remaining spectator on his back. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on him. This wasn't just about standing up for himself. It was about challenging a system that too often failed to see its own flaws. Outside, Marcus pulled out his phone and began typing a detailed email to his office. He included every observation, every interaction, and every instance of disparity he had witnessed. By the time he hit send, he knew this was only the beginning.